Now I want to introduce today's speaker. The committee planning this event wanted us to have an eminent historian for our speaker. David Kennedy is not only one of our country's most distinguished American historians, but he has a long history of working with the Stanford Historical Society. He was also instrumental in the founding of the Lane Center for the American West. He was the first director of that center, and he has long been active in local history, including the creation of the Palo Alto History Museum. David was a Stanford undergraduate in history. He received his doctorate at Yale. He returned to Stanford, where he taught many students, wrote many books, and remains now as a professor emeritus. David received the Pulitzer Prize for his book, Freedom from Fear, a book about Franklin Roosevelt, the Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. If you've not read it yet, give yourself a treat and go and read it. He is now the editor of the Oxford History of the United States, a highly respected series about American history. David, I think, is superbly qualified to give us perspective on Stanford history as we seek to preserve and understand it.
So, thank you, Larry, and it's especially gratifying for me to see so many old friends. Oh, hold it. Strike that. So many familiar faces here. And I want to thank Sunny, of course, for hosting this event. And I want a special thanks to Josh Schneider. I think I saw Josh moving someplace. Are you here? The university archivist who helped me excavate a lot of data that informs today's remarks. And I want to thank all of you for your interest in Stanford, and especially for your participation in and commitment to the Stanford Historical Society. In the next few minutes, I want to do three things. I want to offer you some thoughts about history as a way of thinking and knowing, and then some remarks about Stanford's history. Larry asked me to particularly speak about Stanford's history in the period for which this society has been in existence, and even to back it up to my first appearance at Stanford, which was as an 11-year-old kid in 1952, but I won't take you back quite that far. And then I want to conclude with a few thoughts about the Stanford Historical Society. Now, since it's Sunday, and I'm standing at what is the equivalent, I guess, of the pulpit, I want to take as my text a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 11. There we are told the following: "We all warm ourselves by fires that we did not kindle, drink from wells that we did not dig, eat from orchards that we did not plant, and dwell in cities we did not build." Now, fast forward about 2,700 years, and I'll give you a more contemporary version of the same thought, this from the pen of the recently deceased wonderful historian David McCullough, in a little address of his called simply Why History. And he said, by the way, before I do that, I'll tell you a little story about David McCullough. He and I appeared on a panel together at Oklahoma University a few years ago, and from the stage he told the following story, and he's a reliable guy, so I presume it's not apocryphal. He said that he had recently addressed a group of students, I forget whether it was high school or college, and he gave a talk about the value of history. And he concluded with what he thought was a stirring peroration. He said, "Never forget the lessons of Normandy Beach." So a little knot of students came up to him afterwards, and polite students that they were, they thanked him for his remarks. They said, "Mr. McCullough, but we have just one question for you. Who was Normandy Beach?" I got it straight from his mouth, so. All right, but more seriously, in this lecture that he gave some years ago, Why History, David McCullough said the following. He said, "At their core, the lessons of history are largely lessons in appreciation. Everything we have, all our great institutions, hospitals, universities, libraries, our laws, music, art, poetry, freedoms, everything, is because somebody went before us and did the hard work, provided the creative energy, provided the money, provided the belief. Do we disregard that? And then in one sentence, he said something really punchy. He said, "Indifference to history isn't just ignorant, it's rude." It's a form of ingratitude. I'm convinced, he went on, that history encourages us as nothing else does to have a sense of proportion about life, gives us a sense of the relative scale of our own brief time on earth and how valuable it is. But I think what it really comes down to is that history is an extension of life. It both enlarges and intensifies the experience of being alive. History is about two of the greatest of all mysteries: time and human nature. Well, I could go on quoting at length from people who've given us aphoristic descriptions of what history is all about. William Faulkner, for example, said the past is never dead. It's not even past. Or somewhat more mysteriously, maybe, the British philosopher R.G. Collingwood said, I study history in order to learn three things. First, what it means to be a human being. Second, what it means to be a human being in this time and place. And third, and this is the somewhat mystifying and challenging part of Collingwood's formulation, I study history in order to learn what it means to be a human being different from all other human beings. And there he goes, I think, to the essential matter of interpretation, the way we don't just ingest a series of facts and figures and names and dates, but we try serious historical work is about understanding the patterns that we can discover and arguing about them. And that's where interpretation comes in, and we all have different starting points in that interpretive exercise. At the risk of maybe going on too long about this, I want to share with you one paragraph from Thucydides' introduction to his history of the Peloponnesian War, a paragraph I've used countless times in history classes to try to give students a sense of what the enterprise we're about to engage on in the rest of the seminar or class. So I won't do it in the ancient Greek. I'll do it in English. I couldn't do it in ancient Greek if I tried. But he says the following. It's a little bit dense, but try to stick with me. He said, with reference to the narrative of events that follows, I did not even trust my own impressions, but it rests partly on what I saw myself. He was a general in the Peloponnesian War. Partly on what others saw for me. The accuracy of the report being always tried by the most severe and detailed tests possible. The absence of romance in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest. But I shall be content if it is judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the future. Now, I know that's a little bit dense to take on board on a sunny afternoon like this here in the garden, but let me just call out a few key words in that passage. Narrative, history is storytelling. It's a narrative of events. It's concerned with the real and the actual, not the abstract realm of philosophy. It rests primarily on the accuracy of the report, and history has a long history as a discipline in verifying the authenticity and provenance of documents and evidence of all kinds. And then he makes this really significant gesture about the absence of romance. Historians are not allowed to fabricate. It might be fun and tempting to do it, but it is the cardinal sin. You can't make anything up. You're riveted to the documentary record in ways that really constrain your ability to tell a dramatic or romantic story, but you got to tell it like it was. And then he insists in the last sentence of the paragraph, again, just to call it to your attention, that history is useful. It's not just an ornament to make you look good at cocktail parties. It's useful not as a predictor of the future, but as a tool to help us understand the present and interpret the present and the future. So it's not the key to all understanding by any means, but it is a necessary tool in Thucydides' view to understanding and interpreting the events of our own lifetime. All right, that's the history lesson about history. Let's turn to Stanford history, my second of my concerns this afternoon. And here I'll take as my starting point something that Don Kennedy, when he was president here, said on the morning after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. When he was asked, many of you here will remember familiar faces, what the campus looked like the morning after. And Don was asked by, I presume, a journalist of some sort, will Stanford rebuild these buildings? And he gave a great answer, the kind of answer he was capable of just on the spot. He said, we don't have so much history that we can afford to lose any of it. So of course we'll rebuild. And we did. And you'll see the church was rebuilt, the library was rebuilt, old chemistry was rebuilt, and so on and so forth. All right. Larry asked me to talk about Stanford in the days since I was an undergraduate. I was in the class of 1963. I did see the campus as a young kid in 1952, but that's not really an appropriate starting point. So I came here in 1959. So I'm going to say a few things about Stanford history over the arc of my engagement with it as a student and then later as a faculty member. The class of 63 had 1,352 people. There were then 5,264 undergraduates. The famous ratio of our day, some of you here will remember it, indicated the fact that there were 893 males and 459 women in the entering class. Wallace Sterling greeted us on that first day in September of 1959 by doing what university presidents do in such occasions, telling us something about ourselves. And he pointed out these numbers, the 893 males, 459 women. And then he said, and I quote, "That gives you men an arithmetic advantage, and it gives you young ladies a matrimonial advantage." Ooh. One indication among many that we live today in a different cultural context and environment than we did in 1959. All right, let's go back to 1959. 5,264 undergraduates those days. 77, thank you, Josh Snyder, for excavating all these numbers. 77% of undergraduate students in those days came from public high schools. Today, it's 56%. Also today, 51% of the undergraduate student body are women. No more ratio. There are today 7,554 undergraduates, so the undergraduate class has increased by a factor of roughly 50%. In 1959, there were a little over 3,000 graduate students and postdocs on campus. Today, there's 12,111. So the graduate population has increased fourfold, while the undergraduate population has increased by 0.5-fold, or 50%. At some date in the 1990s, and argue about it one year or the other, but it's in the 1990s, we crossed the threshold where there are more graduate students and postdocs than there are undergraduates, which is an unmistakable sign that we are now a research university in a category that includes just a handful of other principal universities in the world, but that has now become, by far, I think, our dominant and principal mission, and I'll have more to say about it in just a moment. 1959, 65% of us were Californians. I was not, and I thought the Californians are a pretty odd bunch, actually, but that's just my personal opinion. Today, in another sign of just how different the place is, only about 38% of undergraduates are from California. It's still a heavy plural number, but it's not anything like what it once was. In 1959, not incidentally, the year that the medical center moved down from San Francisco to this campus, in 1959, there were 528 faculty members on the university faculty. Today, there's a little over 1,700. So the faculty has expanded by a factor of 3 since 1959. And 48% of all faculty today are at the medical center. And there's a joke one sometimes hears around here, maybe some of you have heard it or even uttered it, that the definition of Stanford today is a medical center with a university attached. And that certainly was not the case when I showed up here as a Callow youth in 1959. The non-academic staff, I couldn't get the numbers, Josh, for 1959, but I got them for 1975. The non-academic staff in 1975, the year that the Stanford Historical Society was about to launch, numbered 5,600 people. Today, it's 19,000 people. So again, another indication this is a wholly different kind of institution than it was just a couple of generations ago. The university budget in 1959 was $33 million. Today's budget, and they report it in a distinctly odd fashion because they exclude the revenue from Stanford Healthcare and the Children's Hospital. That's not the number I'm about to give you. It was 33 million in 1959. Today it's 9.7 billion per year. This is big business. The endowment in 1959 was $126 million. In 2000, it was 9 billion, big changes from the 50s to turn of the century. In 1991, the endowment was recognized as being sufficiently large that a new organization had to be called into being to manage it, the Stanford Management Company, in 1991. And today's endowment, again, there's odd ways of reporting this, but the best kind of summary number is $37 billion. Majors. I was just talking to somebody who was in our class, 63, electrical engineering major. I entered as an electrical engineering major and saw the light and became a history major. And when I was an undergraduate, and indeed the very first years that I was teaching here, I began in 1967 on the faculty, 20% of all undergraduates were history majors. It was the largest single major back in that day. Today, according to data I received, not from Josh, but from the School of Humanities and Sciences, Dean's office, if you put history at Stanford is classified as among the humanities disciplines. Other places it's classified as a social science. We could have an argument about that. But history is in the cluster here we call humanities. And today, if we add together the majors in history, English, all the foreign languages and literatures, philosophy, art, music, drama, religious studies, and I may be leaving one or two others out, altogether, 9% of majors. So again, this is a different institution with a different mission, different purpose, different demography, different character altogether than what it once was. Tuition. In 1959, the year I entered, was then calculated per quarter at $335 per quarter, or $1,005 for the year. Tuition this year is about $62,000. And if you want to adjust the numbers with the consumer price index to reflect real purchasing power then and now, it's still the fact that tuition has grown by a lot more rapidly than the inflationary index. And also back in 1959, we were members of the PAC-8. And of course now we all know we're proud members of the ACC. And it's been said that what we have in common with the Atlantic Coast Conference, compared to what used to be the case, is that in both the Pacific Coast Conference and the Atlantic Coast Conference, they both have the word coast in their name. And that's about the end of the comparison. Just for context, let me give you a few additional numbers. I know I've given you a lot already, but just to give you a little bit further picture of what the national picture looked like in 1959 compared to today. The U.S. population in the census of 1960 was roughly 180 million people. Today it's about 340, almost 350 million people, so we've nearly doubled in size as a society. The California population in 1960 was 15 million. Today it's almost 40 million. GDP, gross domestic product, the basic size of the economy, in 1960 was 0.5 billion, half a billion. Today it's 30 trillion. Household income, average household income in 1960 or 1959 was a little over $5,000. Today it's $89,000. Women's labor force participation rate, those young ladies who were here looking for that matrimonial advantage, 1959 was 37%. That is 37% of all women in the relevant age bracket were working for wages. Today it's 57%. Another dramatic change in our demographic profile. I was unable easily to get nationwide numbers, but I went to some individual states. I can tell you in Alabama, in 1959, the percentage of eligible black voters who were actually registered to vote was 7%. Today it's 46%. The foreign-born in the census of 1970, turns out, showed the lowest percentage of foreign-born people ever in the United States since the first census in 1790, 5%. Today it's a little better than 15%, the highest ever in American history. And here's a really interesting one as far as I'm concerned. The ratio of income between CEOs in Fortune 500 companies and their median employee salary was then 20 to 1. Today it's 285 to 1. So if you want a quick index of what inequality is all about, there's a handy one. The federal budget in 1959 was $74 billion, and the Department of Defense accounted for 50% of that budget. The federal budget today is $6.75 trillion, and Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security account for 53% of that budget. And to repeat, Stanford tuition was $1,005, and now it's $62,000. So that's just some ways to think about not only the passage of national history and international world history in the last few generations, but to think about some changes at Stanford. It's quite clear, I think, I don't need to belabor the point, that the changes nationally, internationally, and right here on this campus over the last 50, 60 years have been nothing short of dramatic. And here I'll share a really unsettling comment that somebody made to me on the occasion of Dick Lyman's memorial service. I had a conversation with Ken Pruitt. Some of you may know him, rather prominent political scientist, took his PhD training here, was the superintendent of the census in 2000, very interesting character. And we were just talking about how Stanford had changed from his days as a graduate student in the 60s and my days as an undergraduate in the 60s. And we went through the little bit of a thought exercise together, the two of us. We said, if you made a list in, let's say, 1960, of the top 10 universities by resources and reputation in the country, and then made up a comparable list of the top 10 universities in this country today on the same indexes of resources and reputation, there would only be one new name, and it'd be Stanford University. And it would be the case not only that Stanford made the list, but dominated the list, always ranks the very top. Happened in half a century or less. And so Ken and I agreed that was an accurate description of what's happened at Stanford since our time on campus years ago. And then he said something that's unsettled me ever since, and at the risk of unsettling you on this happy day, I'll share it with you. He said, you know, maybe it happened too fast. And maybe along the way, Stanford lost its grip on exactly what its mission is and what it aspires to be. I just offer that to you as some person's comment. All right. I promised you I'd conclude with a few observations about the Stanford Historical Society. Let me just underline something obvious. That we today, here on this campus, in our lifetimes, we are digging the wells that some future generation will drink from. We are kindling the fires from which they will warm themselves. We're planting the orchards from which they will harvest. And we're building the cities, as Deuteronomy said, that they will inhabit. I think that's a very important thing. Part of the Historical Society's mission is not only to recollect the past, but to be seriously engaged with preserving the present for the benefit of future generations. Just as we want to know who our predecessors were and what they did and what we have to learn from them, what we can do to not only be grateful for their accomplishments, but maybe improve and build upon them, future generations will have the same expectations about us. They'll want to know. So part of the mission of the Stanford Historical Society, I'm very happy to affirm, is that not only is it expert at recollecting what happened before us, but at preserving what we're doing right now for the benefit of future generations. So I'll end there and thank you all for your engagement and for your interest in history.